Hello and welcome to another episode of Teaching Heroes, the teaching podcast where I talk to educators and teachers. What does it take to turn up every day and teach tomorrow's leaders? And today I have a very special guest onto the podcast, Dean Kilby. Thank you for coming back on Teaching Heroes.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yes, this is your second visit to Teaching Heroes. Our first one, we spoke about health and education. And it's a high viewing episode, Dean. It's right up there. So I think we'll make a bit of difference in the health and teachers world with that one.
I hope so. A younger generation and they're just watching us. And they learn by imitation.
Yes.
As much, not so much what we tell them. They don't listen. Right? No one listens.
No.
So we've got to lead the way and demonstrate what it looks like to, be committed to one's health and look after yourself and demonstrate respect in the world. And it starts with having a respect for your own equipment, this body that we've been given that allows us to proceed through and experience life.
Yeah. And in that episode, for those of the people that haven't watched it, we talked about how I met Dean in the first place, which was back in May 2020 when we're in lockdown and I was already overweight and I ate more and more and then finally realized, okay, no more, I'm done. And luckily a friend of mine who's working with Dean now in Simplr Health had started the program and I was like, that's it. I'm jumping on board to the Simplr Health program and did everything I was told and lost 22 kilos with Dean. So, and that just really, as we talk about in the episode, what that made available to me in my life and how I saw myself. And it's just been a great ride since then. So, so thank you for you and your program. And I recommend everyone go back and watch that one if you haven't already. But today I'm having you back on because I spoke to Professor Doherty in the last episode, and I think like any great conversation you have with a legend like that, it just took a bit for my brain to catch up to everything he was saying. And after the episode, I just was left with so many more questions. And I know that you've been working in the field within the COVID-19 pandemic world. And I was like, Dean, can you please come onto the podcast and answer some questions for me and no doubt the audience. So thank you for coming back on.
Big shoes to fill, or, to follow up from someone like Professor Doherty is a big ask. So I'll do my best. But, I was just so thrilled for you to have that opportunity to interview him and interact with him in that way. He's been a hero of mine. I mean, he's a national treasure, right?
Yeah.
So it's just an extraordinary opportunity, and good on you.
Yeah, thank you. And I didn't even know that you've had that. I suppose everyone loved Professor Doherty. I didn't know about your kind of connection with him until after I'd said, hey, Professor Doherty's coming on the podcast. So yeah, I was very, very excited. But well, gosh, where do we start? What I wanted to, really talk about like vaccines, boosters, conversations with our unvaccinated friends. And I've seen, you've been on other live specials I've watched. And I think, you have a lot to offer, this next part of the conversation, because New South Wales at least is opening up very soon at the time of, this recording. They're opening up next week. Victoria's on the way. And our whole life is about to change again. And I really don't think we're prepared. So, it's great to have you on. So let's kind of start there with vaccines. I mean, I talked about with Professor Doherty the efficacy of the vaccines, and he was very clear that they work. They're having a tremendous impact on transmission here in New South Wales. But how do we know that? It'd be really great to hear about. How do we know when they say 97% efficacy? What does that actually mean?
Yeah. Oh gosh, who knows?
Okay. Okay.
I mean, determining vaccine efficacy is, it's a whole world of and layers of complexity there, and we tend to think in this polarized way of thinking. This, is this good or is it bad? Does it work or does it not work? And you know how life goes; it's always somewhere in the middle. And it's like a sliding scale, depending on the context and the perspective from which you're viewing it, in terms of mitigating the spread. So when you're talking about emerging infectious diseases, you want to contain it as much as possible and lessen the impact that it might have. So firstly, in terms of spread, it's all about that sort of first line of defense in your immune system, which is neutralizing antibodies. Okay, so you hear a lot about antibodies, and there's a difference between neutralizing antibodies, which is a subset of the total amount of antibodies that your immune system might generate against the protein that gets created from the vaccine. In the case of the two leading vaccines here in Australia, which is Pfizer and AstraZeneca, the two different platforms. So Pfizer vaccine's an mRNA-based vaccine, AstraZeneca is an adenoviral vector, which means that there are two different delivery mechanisms of some genetic material that allows the production of the protein in our cells. Okay, our cells will take Pfizer, for example. That was the vaccine that I had pretty early on. I just wanted to make sure that you don't die. So, give it to me. And I wanted to see what effect it had on my functional immunity. So I can measure that. But those antibodies that get elicited in response to a vaccine, not all of them will be neutralizing. Maybe less than 5% of the total, like hundreds of thousands of different antibodies might get created, and only less than 5% will be neutralizing. And what neutralizing means is that those antibodies, these specialized immune proteins, have the ability to bind to that part of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the spike protein, and more specifically, the receptor binding domain at the top of the spike protein. That's the bit that attaches to the human cell via the ACE2 receptor protein. And if you can get an antibody to stop or block that binding, it neutralizes the virus, neutralizes its ability to infect the cell, replicate, and cause damage. So in terms of mitigating spread and infectivity, neutralizing antibodies are the most important aspect. Okay? In terms of minimizing the impact, and again, it's like, what defines impact? Well, there's firstly, you don't want people to die. So there's a process. People get sick, they have severe symptoms, they usually end up in hospital. Hopefully they get to a hospital. And then worst case scenario, ICU, death, right? So that aspect of the immune system, the T cell immunity, cell-mediated immunity, is usually what handles that. So if you think of it, the neutralizing antibodies are like the forward troops, and the T cells are like the reservists. Ideally, you'd want to have a high amount of neutralizing antibodies circulating in your system. Now, unfortunately for us, the nature of the virus itself, it's a respiratory virus. So, infects us via the upper respiratory system, the mucosal layers. We don't have neutralizing antibodies just sitting in those mucosal layers in high enough concentrations to sterilize the virus. So there is a bit of replication that happens. Until, neutralizing antibodies can stop its spread. Hopefully then the T cell immunity can come in, clean up the mess. And if you're vaccinated and you've got good neutralizing antibodies and you've got the T cell immunity, then a lot of the time you won't even know that you've been infected.
And is that why, because the virus kind of starts in the nose, is that why people who might have been vaccinated, might test positive because it's kind of in their nose rather than necessarily replicating in their body?
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And again, there's some, everything gets created in language. So the nomenclature that we use, SARS-CoV-2, so severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2, that denotes the actual virus itself. Like you would say, human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV.
Right.
Right. And in the case of SARS-CoV-2, upon infection, the disease that results from infection is called COVID-19.
All right. Okay.
Akin to HIV causing AIDS.
Okay.
Acquired immunodeficiency disorder, right? Or syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
So COVID-19 is then therefore this disease that's diagnosed at present. We use a diagnostic tool called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, where we detect the viral genome in those various locations. So put it, violate your face, get a swab up there, and then we can amplify, if it's present, the viral genomic material. And then we know, okay, it's present, and we will just classify that as COVID positive.
Okay, so you could just have the virus in your nose. You might not necessarily have COVID-19 disease.
At the moment, we're saying that is the case, that you do have COVID-19. Okay. But who knows, in the future, then like some distinction might get drawn in that area as well. Yeah. But that's the problem. Plus, what makes it complex is this phenomenon of, see, if people who are symptomatic are the only ones that are of concern, then anyone with symptoms, it's easy to recognize and put measures in place to prevent further transmission, i.e. isolation, right? But with this virus, there's asymptomatic transmission, which means no symptoms, but the virus is present and there's still the capacity to transmit it to someone else who may or may not be more susceptible, more vulnerable, have less of either, vaccine-acquired immunity, and could potentially cause more damage. So that's a real concern, and has been for this particular virus. And what was great, from the man himself, Professor Doherty, when you interviewed him, was he said, we thought it would be more fatal than what it has been. But of course, like there's just a sheer number of people that have been tested positive. Fatality, he said, was somewhere around 0.8 to 0.3%. But, this asymptomatic transmission and also the phenomenon of long COVID was something that we weren't really prepared for.
You talked then about if you have good neutralizing antibodies and the virus wouldn't replicate. How would we know that? Is that just by nature of being vaccinated, that you can be confident that you have those neutralizing antibodies, or
not really? I mean, as a general rule, yes.
Okay.
But there's going to be a good cohort of patients that don't elicit sufficient neutralizing antibody responses. And it's not just a phenomenon specific to the vaccines or various vaccine platforms, even from natural infection. So if you're naturally infected by the virus, then there is some variability in the antibody mediated response, the humoral response to the virus. So pretty early on in the piece, in the pandemic last year, there was a paper published in Nature Biotechnology, I think it was, and then it was describing a way of measuring these neutralizing antibodies. And then there was another paper, I think it was Lancet Micro, maybe, detailing the neutralizing antibody responses and wane rate in a cohort of about 164 naturally infected patients. This was out of Singapore. And so we talk about declining immunity post-vaccination, but that too happens with naturally infected patients, right? And so the variability, it can look like this. You can be COVID positive and you may or may not elicit a strong immune response. What we see correlates with a strong immune response in terms of neutralizing capacity is symptom severity. So the more severe the symptoms, the better in general the neutralizing antibodies that you develop.
Okay.
The problem with this virus is most COVID positive cases, the symptomology is mild to moderate.
Yeah.
So this is another interesting nuance and phenomenon with this disease is those, we talk about comorbidities. Most everyone has comorbidities. I mean, if we're talking about being fat, 2/3 of the adult population in this country are overweight.
Yeah.
Half of that group is obese.
Yeah.
And now we're concerned about kids and teenagers, the younger population. I mean, 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 younger people are overweight, at least, right? So it's not like everyone's got this pristine immune system. Yeah. Okay. And then you talk about, that's just the impact of metabolic dysfunction on the immune system, and in particular, the innate immune system, which is the first defense against the virus. Then you talk about people with autoimmune conditions. Even if there's some immune dysregulation, as benign as, not as necessarily that benign, but say rosacea or eczema or psoriasis or asthma. I mean, there's such a prevalence of asthma here in this country. And so there's some immune dysregulation there as well. So you got both immunometabolic dysfunction in a large proportion of the population. And then you talk about what helps to empower your immune system and make it more robust. Well, a lot of that has to do with your gut microbiome. And we're all screwed because we've all had antibiotics.
Mine's a lot better since I met you. That's for sure.
I know. You can, push it in the other direction, make it more healthful to a degree. But we've all had antibiotics. It's one of those necessary evils that you need, but otherwise we'd all be dead. But it does have an impact because it's like an atomic bomb going off in your gut and creates like a desert for opportunistic bacteria to come and repopulate that area of your gut. And so the immune response is, there are some researchers who have really done some amazing work in describing the gut microbiome that characterizes or predicts more severe symptomology in COVID-19 positive patients.
Okay. So going back to what you were saying about natural infection not necessarily equaling good protection from, say, being reinfected, because I know, a student of mine and a few other people I know who've tested positive to COVID-19 and are now saying, well, they can't get vaccinated for another 6 months because since they've had the infection. That doesn't necessarily mean then that she or they'll be protected for that 6 months from being reinfected.
Not necessarily, no, not at all. Who said that they can't get the vaccine? Is that something the government said, or?
That's the current, government policy.
Is it really? Yeah, okay. Got it. Well, there's some, maybe, I mean, given I think Scott Morrison has just bought a heap of vaccines, but, really wasn't that long ago, there was only about enough vaccines for about a quarter of the world's population for this year. So we think that there's just like tons of this stuff readily available.
Why didn't we get more vaccine? Why?
So maybe, I think in the ideal situation, you'd want to have the vaccine to protect yourself from the disease. Okay, so if you're naive, in other words, you've never been exposed to SARS-CoV-2, the ideal situation is to have some degree of immunoprotection specifically against that virus, without having to run the risk of whatever it might do to you and your body, because there's a bit of variability there. We didn't know about this long COVID phenomenon. It's just now we're learning more and more, and it's it's not pretty. It's not looking good. The impact on obviously respiratory health, and we saw that with especially the professional athletes in the United States. It's healthy, fit, supreme kind of athletic beings, and they got COVID-19 and they recovered, and thinking that they're okay, and then they try and get back into training, and it's a real struggle for them.
Yeah.
Just can't breathe properly or recover properly.
Is it related to how severe the disease is, long COVID? Like if you have a mild case of COVID-19, are you less likely to get long COVID, or will you still have ongoing concerns? Do they know that yet?
Yeah, I don't know that. I think there's some data that's suggesting long COVID, the source of it is somewhat of an autoimmune type response.
Okay.
So I don't know. I'm kind of might be talking out of my backside here, but if this is the spike protein that binds to the ACE2 receptor on the surface of our cells, in that bound, if there's enough virus in our system and the immune system is really having to ramp up, and this is especially so in those with perhaps the innate immune system, the first part of our defense is compromised because you're metabolically unwell, right? You eat too much sugar and too much carbohydrates throughout the day, and your insulin levels are really high, and this can impact your innate immune system. So if that's compromised, then the virus has more time to replicate inside the individual.
Okay, I get it.
Okay, now that puts that individual at risk of more severe disease, potential death. Okay, and that's why those with comorbidities, from obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, all this sort of stuff, they're more at risk of severe symptomology and potentially, death, right? But then on the other end of that, the immune system has to fight harder to then stave off that infection. Now, if you get through it, which it looks like most people do, you end up with a better immune response.
Okay, to the virus.
So to the virus. So that's the sort of the paradox in that situation. So you would want, ideally, if you're naive, some level of protection. The spike protein from the vaccine has a transmembrane domain. So it lodges in the membrane of the cell that's making that protein. Okay. Bear with me. Which means it's less likely, if at all, going to be able to circulate and bind to ACE2 receptor proteins on other cells. Okay. It's just sitting there stuck in the membrane of the cell in which the mRNA got into, protein got made, and it just got jammed there, and then the immune system can recognize it. Okay. Why is that relevant? Well, if there's enough virus in an infected patient, you get the virus, you got a lot of virus replicating, and there's a lot of virus binding to ACE2 receptor proteins. Now, your immune system's really kicking into gear, and it's developing antibodies, and if there's some remnant proteins and virus sticking around for a period of time, it's not just the antibodies binding to the spike protein. You may get some antibodies that bind to the bound complex. Okay. Like that. So it's stuck to both the spike protein and the ACE2 receptor protein. You clear the virus, your body gets rid of that. Well, bugger, now you've got antibodies that still bind to your ACE2 receptor protein. So now you have a bit of auto attack. Okay. Do you get that?
Yeah, the penny just dropped. I was like,
right?
Okay, I got it.
We think there's some little bits of evidence suggesting maybe that is the case, but we'll find out in time as, all these geniuses, it's just all these thousands of geniuses at work on all of this all at once. It's amazing. Yeah. And all this data is coming out and different interpretations of it. So you kind of have to look at it all from the perspective of Mars. Like you got to kind of pull yourself all the way back and kind of look at all of this as best as you can, not get too hooked on any one phenomenon. But neurological disorders, I think in the future there'll be a phenomenon, something in the realm of COVID-related dementia. Talked about respiratory impacts, musculoskeletal impacts, but even gut problems, gastrointestinal problems. There's a large proportion of COVID-19 positive patients experience gut problems. Yeah. So, we weren't expecting this in 20 to 50% of COVID positive patients.
Well, that's what they didn't realize that, say, diarrhea was a symptom until, quite a couple of months really into it. They were kind of looking at respiratory symptoms, and then they were like, oh, hang on a sec, there's these other symptoms that can come out of patients as well. So, okay.
so the ideal way, how do you protect yourself? Well, you got to do the basic stuff first. If you're fat, you've got to handle that. You got to lose the weight. You got to restore some, proper, if there's metabolic dysfunction, and it's not just bigger people. There's metabolically unwell people that look like they're at a normal body weight. So you want to get all your health checked out and make sure that you're on point. You haven't got non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which 2/3 of the adult population in Australia are at risk of, primarily because of too much sugar consumption. So all of that sort of stuff compromises your ability to stave off some of these infections and recover properly as well. You want to make sure your nutrition's on point, all that sort of stuff. Then you want to prime your immune system and have some level of frontline protection, have some neutralizing antibodies. The most powerful way of doing that is vaccination. Whatever you think about, the current vaccines, I don't recommend people wait. I mean, that would have been an ideal situation to have a broad spectrum of licensed vaccines available for us that we can kind of pick and choose from. But, I think what was seen is the current ones, they're safe, they're effective in generating neutralizing antibodies, very effective at preventing hospitalizations and death upon infection. So, that we know now.
And we're seeing it played out in New South Wales as well. I mean, the case numbers are dropping as the vaccination rate went higher, the level of cases went, and as is hospitalizations and death are decreasing as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the vaccines, the current vaccines, they just provide the ability of the immune system to be able to recognize the spike protein. Right. And not all of those antibodies will be neutralizing. But if you can follow that up with some exposure to the virus, right? So you can be exposed to the virus and not die, right? Because you've had some previous immune priming from the vaccine. Then you get a more broad spectrum, powerful immuno response. At some point we'll all be exposed to the virus. That's just the way it's going to go. So I think, as hard as it's been to have to deal with the lockdown and all of that, it's, that's unfortunately, it's just necessary when you're dealing with a new kind of pathogenic agent that's spreading it to this degree. These types of strategies need to be implemented.
And I think you said something, I think, really important earlier, where you said there are people who are understandably nervous about what has felt like it's felt rushed, even though, scientists and everything are saying, look, we didn't rush the data's still the data. It feels quick for people. And even people who vaccinate really readily to things like measles and chickenpox, no problem, vaccinate their children, vaccinate themselves. With this vaccine, there is some hesitancy there around the speed, and they want to wait. But as you so rightly point out, it's like we actually just don't have that luxury. The virus is circulating within our community now. You can wait, but you're at risk of contracting the virus in a naive body, as you say. So it is a hard choice, but that's the reality of the choice.
I mean, it makes me reflect back on my process before I got the vaccine, and it was like, I was speaking to some really smart people, and initially the advice was wait. Right. What's the point? I mean, nothing's happening in Australia anyway. So it makes no difference. Just wait. And then there was enough short-term data, especially from areas in the world like Israel, etc. For us to know that, okay, it's short-term data suggests it's pretty good. Long-term data, who knows? I had to kind of look, I'm in my, I'm 44. I'm not going to have any more kids. Okay. Let's put that to the side then. You got to go through all this process, and then at some point one of my mentors, I found out he got vaccinated with one of the mRNA vaccines, and I rang him up and said, "All right, what was the process that what you went through to get this?" And he just was really frank with me. He just said it was really simple. It was just cultural peer pressure. Right? So,
my friends got it, so I got it.
Well, where he's from, it's he's one of the senior leaders in that part of the world, and it was all about that, right? So, and given his profile in the world, it's if he in Asian cultures, it's all about the photograph.
Yeah.
So, if you don't show up for the photograph, then it's if he was missing from that, it could be construed as a political statement, and he wasn't willing to deal with that. But and then I said to him, at that point, this is pretty early on, well, what about me? What should I do? And he's like, no, just wait.
Yeah, right.
And who knew I was like more comfortable with the protein subunit vaccines, such as the Novavax vaccine, but who knew what was going to happen? But then the data just kept pouring out of those cohorts that have been vaccinated, and it was just looking more and more realistic that is just a great way to go early on. So I thought
so much data in Australia too, like the UK and UK were vaccinating with the same vaccines that we bought. It was like we could see, literally millions of people were being vaccinated before us. We were in a kind of privileged position to kind of look over and go, oh yeah, they look like they're still alive. They haven't turned into zombie land over there, as far as we know.
I looked at the Australian government screwed up. They, but it wasn't like a deliberate thing. It was just they put their eggs in a couple of baskets. That one was a vaccine development project here in Australia that didn't pan out well. There's a basic flaw in the design there, and then the other one just copped some bad publicity, and AstraZeneca, trying in their attempt to do the right thing and offer it at cost, basically not make money, and they didn't have money to invest in all the required sort of PR and education that was, probably they did. These companies have big money. I don't know.
Maybe they didn't expect such an undermining of their vaccine
I think so,
prominent
right.
scientists and communicators in Australia.
Yeah, exactly. And then everyone hid out, and then it was like all this science, what there was to be communicated came from the politicians and not the science communicators and the scientific community here. And it was, I'm like, where are all the scientists? So, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I know some of the experts, and I can communicate some of it in a way that makes sense to the lay person. So I had to step up to whatever degree I could, and not that I had any real platform to do that, but, for those that I did have access to and that would listen to me, I was able to make a difference to.
Yeah.
Well,
I that was for me, once you were vaccinated and you told me your process, I was going to get vaccinated anyway, but it did help to have access to someone like yourself to really explain what it was, to explain the data.
I'll tell you what the impetus was for me, right? So we talk about neutralizing antibodies.
Yeah.
Up until recently, I'm talking like March last year.
Yeah.
There has never ever been a cost-effective, rapid way of measuring that part of your functional immunity to anything, right? Okay. So to measure neutralizing antibodies against the virus, it's not an easy thing to do. You need, particularly with this virus, which is pathogenic, you need a biosecurity level 3 laboratory, which is quite an expensive facility. There aren't these everywhere, right? So there's only a fixed number of these laboratories in the world. You need someone with the expertise who can work in that kind of a laboratory and handle a live virus. You take a patient's blood sample, serum or plasma, you put the virus into their blood sample, mix them together. If they've got neutralizing antibodies, they will neutralize and sterilize the virus.
Okay.
If they don't, then the virus remains active.
Okay.
How do you know if it's sterilized or not? You get human cells that express the ACE2 receptor protein on their surface, and you grow them in a flask, in a monolayer, right? And then it covers the whole bottom of that plastic flask. You put the virus that's been mixed with the patient's blood, serum or plasma, onto the cells. If the virus is active, it'll bind to the cells, do its bit, cause destruction and damage amongst those cells.
How long does that take, that whole process?
That whole process will take about 2 to 3 days.
Okay.
Minimum.
That's just one patient.
Yeah, one run. And you'll look at it under the microscope and you'll see plaques, like holes in the monolayer. That's where the virus has had its way with these cells and lysed them, right? And however, contrast that to someone who's, for example, been either they've convalesced and recovered from natural infection, they've got strong immunity, or they've been vaccinated, and they've got antibodies that can neutralize the virus, mix it with that, the virus gets inactivated, sterilized, put that on the cells, it won't do anything.
Okay.
And you'll get degrees of protection. And so you might go from no protection, the plaque is that big, to some protection, the plaque is this big.
Okay.
In comparison to full protection, there's no plaques.
Okay.
So we call it a plaque reduction assay.
Okay.
Very, very expensive, right? So then there's this genius scientist in Singapore who creates a biochemical simulation of that test, that gold standard virus neutralization test, which all vaccine developers use, where the test can be done very cost effectively in less than 2 hours.
Yeah.
Probably an hour.
Yeah.
Right? And so I'm like, screw it. That's what we need. That's what's going to help us get out of lockdown. Locking down is the easy part. How the heck do we get out, as we're all experiencing now? How do you stage it? There's so much uncertainty here, talking about vaccines and do they work, do they not work? And people are saying, what's the big deal? You know, you get the vaccine, you can still contract COVID-19, and there's nuances that, and you can't assess it unless you've got a foundation of understanding in immunology, virology, emerging infectious diseases, the components of the immune system. I mean, you're talking to Peter Doherty, the guy who, described the mechanism with which T-cell immunity handles and destroys virus-infected cells. Like he won the Nobel Prize for that. And you're talking to him about neutralizing antibodies at that end. And he didn't really know that much.
No. He was just like, just boost them. And I was like, but I have so many more questions.
Because that from a government perspective, that the government is paying for all the vaccines and making them available for us, that makes sense given how previously expensive the virus neutralization test is. Right. And how potentially dangerous it is and all that sort of stuff. Just, boost. But you kind of like throwing darts in the dark. What if someone doesn't need? What if you're one of these people who I think I am, from what I've measured myself so far, my neutralizing capacity, even against the Delta variant, is really, really strong. Really strong. So I think I might have, there's going to be some longevity to that level of protection for me. Other people, it wanes really quickly. But if you've got really strong immunity already, whether it be from vaccination or from, infection-acquired immunity, maybe you don't need a booster.
So can you tell us about how you started to work with the scientists in Singapore and how you've been testing your...
Well, I knew Professor Linfa Wang, who's, in my view, probably the most important scientist on the planet right now in the context of this pandemic. So he's a virologist, started off as a molecular biologist, got into virology. He trained me in the early days back in 1998. So 23 years ago, something like that. Jeez.
We're old now, Dean.
I know, it's scary. So half my life ago, I was in the Australian Animal Health Laboratories, part of the CSIRO, and Professor Linfa, he wasn't a professor then, trained me, and he went on to be, working on Hendra virus. That's what we researched together. And so my initial sort of training, biochemistry, molecular biology, microbiology and immunology, that was my undergraduate, and then biotechnology. And so in molecular virology, we worked on Hendra virus, and that was the first kind of zoonotic spillover that went from bats to an intermediate animal. It was the horse in this case, and then the equine species, and then to humans. And then there was an outbreak of Nipah virus in Malaysia in early 1999. And it was really exciting back then. You know, it's always exciting, science and infectious diseases, when people are dying, right? And governments throw money at it, and it's like, you know, it's just like so boring when people aren't dying. There's no funding for anything, right?
Well, just as a side note, you know, it is, I think that's the other people don't get. That's why the vaccines have been developed so quickly, is because of the money that's been going into the funding. It's like, it's nothing to do, the science process isn't as slow as what people think it is. It happens a lot quicker when there's like, you know.
Yeah, it's really expensive to do these studies. And, you know, there were some lessons learned from the SARS outbreak, but so then Nipah in Malaysia, and then there was SARS, right? And Linfa, and again, Nipah went from bats to pigs to humans. And then there was the SARS outbreak, whatever it was, 18 years ago or something. And Linfa was the number one scientist, and he was the guy that identified bats again as the host reservoir of SARS. And, you know, SARS, it's like the movie Contagion. It really was like that, where there's one guy gets in a lift, literally in a lift with 6 other people, I think it was, and coughs. They all get infected, and just so happens that there was all these people that had converged into this one location from all over the world, particularly the Asian countries, for all these conferences. It's like conference season, right? And then they all go back to their home countries, and that's what spread that outbreak, right? But it really was severe acute respiratory syndrome. And whereas this virus is not so severe in the majority of cases.
But more transmissible, right?
Very, very transmissible. So SARS, and then Ebola and MERS, which is more fatal. And now SARS-CoV-2. So Linfa's kind of had some knowledge based on that. And then he advises some organizations like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. Because when these viruses break out, you don't know how long they're going to last. You know, there was no vaccine that got licensed for SARS. Right. Because it kind of, it came to an end. So there's always this kind of like cautious approach, like big pharmaceutical companies, the ones that have the capacity to fund this type of research and develop these medicines and see it all the way through the full phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trial process, and then further invest in the post-market analyses and follow-ups and all of that sort of stuff. Who's going to invest in all of that with an outbreak of something you don't know if it's just going to die out on its own? So there was this CEPI, CEPI, was kind of like this coalition where how can we get philanthropy and funds available for just such an outbreak where maybe they can fund research? And then there was and governments started investing, you know, the WHO and all of this sort of stuff. So just hundreds, thousands of scientists, really smart people, just all get invested in how can they impact this and make a difference. And you know, the research wasn't compromised, but it did happen fast. And, you know, even for people in the know, it's kind of a bit, oh, you know, do I really want that in me yet? You know, let's, you know, let everyone else around the world where there's more of a press for it because the infectivity was higher, let us know if it's safe or not. You know?
And so can you take us then to that? I love this story, you know, it's Easter, you know, Easter weekend in 2020, and you're in lockdown, and you start to realize the impact that you might be able to have here.
So I was in the United States in March, and I got back on March 19, and then everything, so I was quarantined at home, and everything shut down on the evening of the 22nd, I think it was. So I got back just in time. It was weird traveling and everything. I mean, it was just really bizarre at that time. And so, you know, I was in communication with Linfa in Singapore, and it's like, what's the latest? You know, what's going to happen here? And you know, everything started to change. And my business, I had a sort of a product-based business. I was importing products from Canada and you know, sort of a health-based business here, but that too came to a halt.
Yeah.
And it was slowing down. It was running out of product, and I had tens of thousands of dollars worth of product sitting on pallets in a warehouse in Canada, and planes stopped flying and borders closed. And I was like, what the heck do I do here?
Yeah.
And then it was the Easter weekend. It was the Easter weekend last year, and I was sitting at home by myself, and I've got this, great view from my place, and I was just staring out into yonder, wondering what all the happy people are doing in the world, right here in Sydney, with their families, having a good time, Easter weekend, whatever, making the most of it. And I was by myself, and I was just kind of thinking about the whole situation and what am I going to do? And I'm hearing people left, right, and center pivoting. And it's like, you got to pivot. People are creating all these new businesses and getting into selling hand sanitizer and all this sort of weird.
Yeah, the gin companies started to sell hand sanitizer.
Right?
Yeah.
And I started to think about it, and I just kind of saw that everyone's trying to figure out how to best survive this whole situation. And not just survive it. There are those who had the kind of wherewithal to even try and make themselves look fabulous.
Yeah.
In and amongst it all, like, oh, I'm not going to let this get to me. You got to be positive. And, ultimately trying to be positive disempowers people, right? Because that's what keeps the negativity in existence, right? It's always that polarized thing. So, what makes a difference is actually dealing with what's actually happening in reality. So I gave myself the time and space to kind of just be with that and think. And I thought, well, what could I contribute? If I gave up the notion that my life has been negatively impacted and poor me, and what am I going to do? It's like, well, in some degree, I kind of got empowered in that everyone was screwed.
Yes.
It was like a leveling of, how you get disempowered comparing yourself to others. And you see it, especially when you're online and social media and all that sort of stuff, and you're looking at everybody else's profiles, and people are seemingly doing good things. And even in the face of this calamity, they're still positive and it's like, And I thought, no, everyone's screwed. It was like a leveling of the playing field. I don't have to compare myself to any of that. It's like, okay, from here, what could I create in this new world that's about to emerge? We will get through this, but could I contribute to that? Could I contribute to us getting through this powerfully? What's actually wanted and needed right now? So I just to my right here, my daughter's got a, I'll show you, hang on. It's like where she does her artwork and stuff. There was a whiteboard.
Yeah.
I sat in front of my daughter's whiteboard for a couple of days and just started to list out, okay, what could I contribute?
Yeah.
If I was less concerned about my lot in life, what are my core competencies?
Yeah.
And what are my shelf assets?
Yeah.
What do I have at my disposal that I could put to use? And I thought, well, people will need assistance if they're concerned about their own immunometabolic health. And I have some knowledge in that, and I have some expertise in being able to coach people and really work with them through a process for that result.
Yeah.
And what could I also do to assist getting us through or out of lockdown situations, potentially even assist in ending the pandemic. So I rang Prof. Wang in Singapore and said, all right, what's the latest? What are you doing? What can I contribute? And he shared with me the full details of this test that he'd developed that can measure functional immunity. And I asked, where could it make the biggest difference? And he said, Dean, in developing countries, rich countries, we're going to get through this one way or the other. There'll be a big impact on our economy, but we can afford whatever medicines get created, and that'll happen pretty quickly. But when we get through this, and if things start to open up, if developing countries aren't protected and have the resources available to them to move through this with some degree of distinction of actually what's happening, we're not free.
No.
And that, then it was a hard thing to really push here in Australia. I had an audience with the government's COVID-19 testing task force team pretty early. And I pitched into them this idea, and they loved it. And they thought, oh my God, this is exactly what we need. And this is going to help us move through. They couldn't even sell it into the Department of Health.
Yes.
So I was like, bloody hell, what is this going to take? And it was just me. Like,
yeah.
You know, it was frustrating for months and months and months. And I thought, right, I need a pathology partner. And I found a pathology partner.
Yeah.
And he got really inspired, but he didn't quite understand the whole thing, because there's a lot to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
And then he got busy with all the COVID-19 PCR testing, and he went out of communication for months.
Yeah.
And I just kept hounding him because I knew he was the one. Right? Knew he was the one. I kept calling, literally, I'd schedule it in my phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Call him every week. And I just call it, and he wouldn't answer. And then one day he answered.
Yeah.
And then I updated him on what we now know and have learned over the past few months. And he just goes, oh my God, you know, okay, let's do this.
Yeah.
And he was applying for his staff at the pathology lab to be vaccinated early on.
Yeah.
So I proposed to him that we do the study with his staff to validate this test amongst vaccinated people here in Australia. And so I spearheaded what we call the Immune2Covid study. And they were all vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine, and we measured their neutralizing antibodies before, during, and after, 3 months after, 6 months after. We now have that data.
Yeah, right.
And it was amazing. Everyone was naive, which means they had no neutralization capacity against SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah.
After dose 1, the variability in response was just so great.
Oh, really?
People as low as like 5% neutralization, so negative after dose 1. People had, 80% neutralization after dose 1, right? After dose 2, and this is why it's important to have the 2 doses, everyone pretty much ramped up to 90% plus. Okay. And then 3 months later, some people had dropped into the negative range.
No, really?
The majority of people are still pretty high, right?
Yeah.
And then 6 months later, we can see there's, again, variability, and there's a wane in pretty much everyone.
Yeah.
And what we...
Except for you, right? You're still up in 90.
Yeah. So, there's genetics, and there's also how you look after yourself. But about what's really powerful about this test is we can also measure, even though you get vaccinated with a vaccine designed to protect us from the Wuhan virus.
Yeah.
Now there's different variants.
Yeah.
80% of the infections across the globe now is Delta.
Yeah.
So how well does that vaccine protect against Delta?
Yeah.
We can measure that.
Yeah.
I can take someone and get their blood, and I can tell you just how protected you are against the Delta variant.
Because that's people's worry. You hear that a lot. People are like, oh, but the vaccines were developed against the ancestral virus and we don't know Delta. But you're saying we do. We do know that Delta, that the vaccines are just as effective.
Yeah, this clade of viruses, this sort of family group of viruses, we call them sarbecoviruses. So SAR refers to the SARS aspect of it, the nature of the pathology, and beta coronaviruses, the class and so forth. So sarbecoviruses, the way in which they infect our cells bind to the ACE2 receptor protein. That receptor binding domain of the spike protein is so highly conserved that can't change too much. Okay. Now, compared to the Wuhan virus, a Delta variant has, if that's a protein, and protein's made up of amino acid subunits, there's 2 amino acid changes. Okay. Now, what we can see, yes, that does impact the affinity and avidity, so the ability of the neutralizing antibodies to bind and how strong it binds. It does affect it. So what we see is about, on average, those vaccinated with Pfizer will have maybe a 10 to 30% lower neutralization capacity against the Delta variant compared to against the originating Wuhan virus. Okay. But you still have the T cell immunity. That's
Okay.
why it still protects against severe disease and hospitalizations and death.
Okay.
Right? There'll be some lacks in its ability to protect against infection and spread.
Okay.
Okay, 2 parts.
Okay. Okay.
And the beta strain originated out of South Africa. That's got 3 amino acid changes.
Yeah.
So that's a real concern.
Yeah, you said that they were worried originally that would be the one that would come into Australia. So they were kind of relieved, even though Delta's more transmissible.
Yes.
They were kind of relieved because the vaccines are still quite effective against that virus. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
and
where
even against all the variants of concern, VOC, we call them variants of concern. So that's the WHO declares which variants are of concern.
Yeah.
So alpha, beta, gamma, delta, like that. Certain variants of concern. Before the Olympic Games.
Yeah.
So I tried to pitch this approach into.
I thought it was a great idea.
I know, and let's see if we can protect the Australian athletes and the teams, the support teams that are going to Japan, because it's like such a concern. You've got people from all over the world.
Yeah, right.
It's like, is this going to be a melting pot for the emergence of, recombination of different? I mean, imagine if you get infected with alpha variant and beta variant and maybe something else, and they replicate, and you get recombination within the individual, and maybe there's the emergence of another variant, and who knows. So I pitched this in, the door got shut in my face by the medical director of the Australian Olympic team, understandably as well. I mean, it was all so new. What if they have some fully vaccinated athletes whose neutralizing antibodies are very low?
They didn't want to know.
They don't know what to do clinically. Do you boost them? What do you boost them with? It's like, we hadn't yet wrapped our head around boosters and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I can't say, I'm not a clinician, I can just kind of provide some scientific rationale and biological plausibility, but the clinical decisions have to be made by them. So I think to a degree they felt better off not knowing, because they didn't know what to do if they did know, right? However, the deputy medical director was fascinated, and he wanted to know for himself. So we measured his, and if you've got on the test, if you measure above 80% neutralization, so we would stratify that and call that very high.
Yeah.
We've got a 90% confidence that you can be exempted from molecular testing, PCR and rapid antigen testing, and or quarantine requirements for 3 months.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Okay.
Now it's going to be, we're confident in that, like against all the known variants of concern.
Yeah.
So with my neutralizing capacity is above whatever, 96, 97%, like bulletproof, but we'll see. I might look like a real idiot if I do come down with something,
couple of months.
But there's from real world data, what we've seen, we've got a 90% confidence around that. And this has been observed from both, Vietnam, Israel, and Singapore. Those who have been vaccinated and then experience what we call a breakthrough infection. Where, although they're fully vaccinated, they still got infected and tested COVID-19 positive. Those that got tested because there's some symptomology and then it's severe enough for them to be hospitalized. I mean, that's only in those whose neutralizing antibodies was less than 65% neutralizing capacity.
So when people talk about their concern about breakthrough infections, I guess what we need to be responsible for is that it's not to say the vaccines aren't working. It's just to say that the vaccines are variable in individuals. In
eliciting that neutralizing antibody response, you get some people, whether it be from vaccination or from natural infection of the virus, that will have protection for decades.
Yeah.
Right. And then there are people as short as 35 days.
Yeah. But there's no way to know that unless,
you can only measure it at the individual level.
Yeah.
So that, saying that you need a booster dose at 6 months.
Yeah.
It's kind of, like I said, just throwing darts in the dark.
Yeah.
And a lot of that information and a lot of that thinking is coming out of populations like in Israel.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's 6 to 8 months post-vaccination. So we can collect that data and start to analyze it. But you got to remember that the first people vaccinated were the most vulnerable, which was the older people. So as we age, our immune system, the robustness of the immune system and its ability to elicit this kind of a response decreases anyway. So older people generally, elicit less of an immune response, whether it's to the vaccine or natural infection, and demonstrate a faster wane rate. So the immunity decreases faster in older people. Now, when the data from younger cohorts starts to get thrown into that mix, that metric on waning immunity will start to level up.
Okay.
As that gets included. Right?
Yeah. So where is the Immune2Covid study now? So are you still, you know, do you still have participants that you're researching in? Are you ready to?
Yeah, I think we've got enough data, and there's enough data around the world anyway that gets published from people that probably do it way better than us. But, you know, a lot of the neutralizing antibody assays around the world are done using either the gold standard virus neutralization test, which I detailed, or the pseudo virus neutralization test, which is still expensive, takes 2 to 3 days minimum. And it's a pseudo virus because the SARS-CoV-2 is so pathogenic. You take a more sort of inert, less pathogenic virus, engineer it so it kind of mimics the ability to bind to the ACE2 receptor protein, but it's not infectious, it's not dangerous. And you could do that in a lower containment facility. But it's still unbelievably expensive, takes a high level of expertise to run the test, and it takes too long. So what we need to do is similar to the validation study I did with Pfizer. Do that with AstraZeneca as well, see how that compares. That'll be interesting to see, does it elicit as an equivalent variability in neutralizing antibody response, and also to what degree does it wane? You know, some of the data we've seen so far out of Singapore is the mRNA vaccines are superior compared to the adenoviral vector vaccines, or even the whole inactivated virus, such as Sinopharm. Right? So the ability to produce neutralizing antibodies using Sinopharm, inactivated virus, is about at its peak the equivalent of a Pfizer vaccinated person 6 months down the road. Okay, but both still very high protection against hospitalization, severe symptomology, and death.
So with all this, we're about to open up. What do you expect is going to happen now in Australia? We'll say New South Wales.
So unpredictable. I mean, it's you know, we can take lessons from other parts of the world. If we look at Singapore, for example, 80% of the population, the whole population, vaccinated. And then, you know, just the other day, they had 3,000 infections and 10 deaths. And, you know, breakthrough infections, those that have been vaccinated and that do get hospitalized and they'll die, or they're already in hospital, you know, they're older. But it's just a numbers game. You know, as the numbers of infections increase, because the government wanted to open up. There's a huge impact on the economy, as everyone's, you know, present to and feeling the impact of.
People's mental health too. I mean, we talk about the economy, but it's not, you know, people are.
I noticed for myself, even the prospect of opening up, there's a bit of a grieving process. I was like, bloody hell, I was just getting used to this whole lockdown thing. I've kind of adapted to a degree, and now I've got to readapt, you know, opening up. People, I'm a geeky scientist. It's like, oh, you got to go out and socialize again and all this. And you start thinking about those activities. It's so weird and bizarre. It's like, you know, eating out at restaurants. What is all that about now? And, and standing around at a bar drinking some, you know, alcohol. What is all that about? You know, we've just gotten kind of our head around starting to get the importance of human-to-human connectivity and the value of real authentic communication. Not necessarily just being able to face-to-face to people. Well, you've got to we've got technology that enables communication, but it's like the quality of the communication. And we started to really see just the gaps in people's general understanding of themselves, of each other, of our place in the world. Oh, what? It's not all about me. I have to consider the greater good of society and have my actions be consistent with that, whatever that looks like. And there's, what's right and wrong and all those kind of polarized way of thinking, and got to get invested in discovering the nuances. It's never, and even biology, it's never 100%. It's always somewhere in the middle, So, and then scientists all of a sudden became relevant, and I became relevant to a few people. And
can we, like, I just realized how long I've kept you, and it's just been such like this fantastic conversation. But one thing I really wanted you to talk about, because I know people have called you who are worried about vaccinating, and I know you've been able to talk to people without this, you're an idiot for not getting vaccinated, or you're stupid, or you've been able to kind of get present, calm those fears in people. And some people have chosen out of those conversations with you to get vaccinated, and some haven't. But I know people are sending people to you to say, hey, talk to this person. Yeah.
I mean, I'm lucky in that I've gotten to work with someone like Professor Wang in Singapore, and, I know a lot of the top, a lot of great clinicians and scientists around the world, and hearing from them different perspectives, whatever their area of expertise is. And then even alternatives like various prophylactic drug treatments and treatment approaches, even with the likes of Professor Doherty, who was really advocating for the use of ivermectin here in Australia. It was like last year, I was like, all right, what can I contribute to that? And you're trying to raise, several millions of dollars for phase 2 trial. And there was some interesting data coming out of a clinical trials center in California in Malibu, where, they were getting some good results, what looked promising and positive. But then other data from around the world was a bit sketchy, and, who knows? So I was privy to have a kind of understanding around all of that. And it's not that I'm just pro-vaccine. I mean, I've never had a flu vaccine. I don't know. One day I might. I don't know. So, but what really had me step over the line and get the vaccine was not anything around my own safety, because the prevalence in Australia was so low. And I'm young and all that sort of stuff, and think I'm healthy. I don't know. But as far as I can tell. So what really had me get vaccinated was Scott Morrison. So politically, Scott Morrison had already said, okay, if you're vaccinated, you'll be able to travel. So clearly that's where everything was happening. That's where it was all going. And the other one was I had booked in to attend the federal budget dinner at Parliament House. In the hopes that I'd, maybe get an opportunity to meet some people of influence, and, I don't know, maybe even stick my finger in Scott's belly and say, hey, what are you doing with that?
Come
help you
sign up.
And see if anyone might listen to my thoughts on how I can contribute to exiting lockdown. Unfortunately, I didn't get, to meet him and so forth, but it's hard to talk about other people's data in a study. And so I thought, well, if I got the vaccine and I measured my own functional immunity and I had my own numbers, I could scream that from the rooftops. And I was naive. Prior to vaccination, I got dose 1. 3 weeks later, my neutralizing capacity was 54.4%. And then after 3 weeks post second dose, it ramped up to 96.5% neutralization. And it was just as high against the beta and delta variants. So I was like, my God, I'm bulletproof. Right. It's an amazingly empowering experience. And I got to tell you, when Dr. Corey Cunningham, the Deputy Medical Director of the Australian Olympic team, when we measured his neutralizing antibody levels, it was in the very high range. So he was able to board that plane on his way to Tokyo confidently, with peace of mind, and just be focused on looking after the well-being of the athletes, and the team. So when people ring me and they're asking, they're like, just give it to me straight. What am I missing here? What do I need to know? I say, listen, there's all the noise. First and foremost, it's a medicine. it's a medical treatment. Yeah. And you've got to look at it as such. So when you look at these things, you got to ask yourself, firstly, is it safe?
Yeah.
Right. Looking at all the data, yeah, the safety profile is good. Short-term safety, and when we vet vaccines, it's really days. Like, is there an acute, immediate response within days to maybe a week or two?
Yeah.
And the safety profiles look, unfortunately, yes, there's some stuff that happens. That's with all medicines, all drugs, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got to kind of take that into account, and it's very, very difficult for us to think in terms of relative risk.
Yeah.
What determines our experience is how it occurs to us. I mean, if someone told me the statistics around shark attacks, it makes no freaking difference to the fear that I experience when I get in the ocean. It's just, I grew up in country Victoria. I didn't grow up near the beach. So I get in the water and it's like I feel the anxiety, right? And I've done some stupid things last year. I actually took a trip to Darwin and went
with the crocodiles.
Oh yeah, I swam across, croc-infested water. I mean, it was just the most thrilling, terrifying thing, but I did it, right? It was probably stupid, and I get across the other side of the water and then it starts raining and everyone else is gone. I'm like, oh my God, the crocodiles, I'm not diluted anymore. So I had to swim across this water in the rain. There was no one else in the water. It was the most terrifying thing ever. So I kind of have an experience of what it might be like for people to get this thing that for them is unknown and it occurs really scary. But at least the data and all the top scientists and clinicians are saying, you know what, this is safe. So safety is number one. Then you want to ask, does it work?
Yeah.
And yeah, so all the data, it works. It significantly protects against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. We know that. Then the third one is it necessary for me right now?
Yeah.
Right. So you got to ask the question, we're kind of fortunate here in Australia that the infectivity, even now, is still, although we're in this lockdown situation, it's really low.
Yeah.
And we're keeping it at bay. If you just opened up, probably, even with the lockdowns, you're still getting 7, sometimes as high as 10 deaths per day. Yeah. I mean, that'll increase tenfold if you just opened up in an unvaccinated population. Okay. So I've explained that to a few people and it's like, well, and you're going to get exposed. It's just what's going to happen. And people go, oh, isn't it just going to turn into a cold?
Yeah.
And will coexist forever with this pathogen. Yeah, but that process where it gets to the point where it can be experienced and it kind of exists with us, just like common cold, the other 4 human coronaviruses, that can take years. That process could take up to 20 years before we reach that level of sort of coexistence and homeostasis.
Yeah.
We don't know, and we don't know if there's going to be another wave and another variant. And like I said, developing countries and as travel opens up and all of this sort of stuff. And there's a real impact now. We've done a pretty damn good job protecting kids and teenagers from exposure. And in unvaccinated populations, who knows? We kind of think maybe, is it an illusion that kids just have a stronger innate immune response, but then can they get long COVID? And what's the impact on the relationship between kids and grandparents now as we open up? I mean, that's, as far as I understand, you know more about this than me, but it looks like kids kind of develop their self-esteem inside their relationship with grandparents. And if that opportunity is kind of severed or tainted in a way where there's all this, who knows what it's going to look like. So at least in Singapore, they opened up, they had those infections. There'll be like staged lockdowns and ways of mitigating that. It really is. And, we can take lessons from other parts of the world, but it's difficult to know what's going to happen. You can't just say the exact same thing is going to happen. Different diets, different health system, different levels of discipline.
Yeah.
I mean, Singapore, they're way more disciplined in following government orders. I mean,
yeah,
we're kind of like, she'll be right.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Oh no. And I think that's it's kind of the concern I have is that I think people think it's like the end, and it's like, no, it's not the end. And what you're pointing to is that everyone's going to get COVID, and the decision that you're actually making is, do you want it in a vaccinated body or do you not? And if you're not vaccinated, what choices are you then making for your family? You're do you then go and visit your elderly parents or your parents who are immunocompromised? I mean, those are the really difficult discussions and decisions that we're all about to make.
Yeah. I think the degree of variability, there's variability in the individual immune response.
Yeah.
There's variability with regards to the immune response with regards to natural infection and or vaccines. There's variability with the different vaccine platforms.
Yeah.
There's variability with the virus itself because it's got different variants.
Yeah.
And then there's variability with regards to the waning immunity.
Yeah.
So I think an important strategy or a tool that could be implemented and used is measuring at the individual level, neutralizing antibody levels.
Yeah.
And then you would know when to boost, especially for at-risk cohorts and populations, those in high contact roles, airport environments and ecosystems, frontline healthcare workers, of course, quarantine security, all this sort of stuff. But as we open up, I think what will happen is the government will kind of go, hey, we've done our bit.
Yeah.
We managed the lockdown. We gave you the vaccines for nothing. It's not for nothing. Everything's going to cost us a lot. Maybe our great-great-great-grandchildren
keep paying.
Yeah, they might still be paying it off. But, at least when we open up, there won't be daily case reports.
No.
There'll just be hospitalizations. That's what will get reported. There won't be mass testing. The testing will just be done point of care or in hospitals upon admission.
Yeah.
I think what will make the difference is, or what will happen is there'll be a deference of accountability to the health individual, the health consumer.
And the businesses as well.
And businesses as well. And it's like, there's certain jobs you can't get unless you've been vaccinated you got your hep vaccine and you got to prove that you're still immune to it, so then you get a booster and, that'll exist as well for entry into certain territories, countries, all that sort of stuff, certain jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. For maybe the next 3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, 3 years. And I don't know whether we're ready for that. And I thank you so much. It's just been such a fascinating conversation, Dean, and I really appreciate you having these conversations with me and others over the last years, because I think I feel a bit more prepared, than a lot of other people because of our conversations. And I think your work is just so fascinating, and it's going to be really wanted and needed.
Yeah. I mean, look, next year is going to be really exciting. And there's just the emergence of so many there'll be new and different vaccines, and there'll be new and different treatment options and processes, and more and more data will be coming out. So we'll have a better understanding of what to do. And people should keep their eye on Professor Lin-Fa Wang.
Yeah. Is the Batman going to save the world, Dean? The
Batman. He's known as the Batman. He really is. I mean, he developed the test that can measure functional immunity, and that's gotten FDA approval, emergency use approval in the United States.
Yeah.
I'm working on its TGA registration here in Australia.
Yeah.
But I can make that available at least for those that can come, and we can take their blood sample. I can run it through the test, and I can let you know. Yeah. So that's useful. I mean, just recently I had a woman who was type 1 diabetic, obese. She was double vaccinated with AstraZeneca and was unsure. And we tested her, and she is not protected against the Delta variant. So she was able to then make an informed decision to not go back to the office for work, to which she had to catch public transport, and instead organize with her boss to stay at home and then talk to her doctor about getting vaccinated again with a different platform, the mRNA vaccine. And then we'll test again, make sure she's protected. And, I've got the Consul General of Malta. He has to go back to Malta to meet with the government there in November, and he's concerned about, is he protected? So, measure his, and so I think it's a useful tool in that regard.
Yeah.
But, but keep an eye on Prof. Wang, because he's also got the standards that the WHO is relying on.
We haven't even spoken about all these other stuff that he's developed.
I know, he's one little lab in Singapore, because he's been involved for the past 25, 26 years in all these other emerging infectious diseases. So it's not like this is all new to him.
Yeah.
This was always going to come about. And not only that, he's got he's developing the 3rd generation vaccine that's going to protect us from the current virus and all the variants and future coronavirus outbreaks, SARS-CoV virus outbreaks. that'll be the game changer. That's a big deal. And he's developed that. And he's also developed the treatment, the monoclonal antibody treatment that can just protect against all these sarbecoviruses. And he's demonstrated that against other viruses derived from bats and pangolins, which is just extraordinary. All 4 key phenomena, all from the one little lab in Singapore, this one guy. I mean, I think it's Nobel Prize worthy.
Yeah.
I think it's just a matter of time. But, it's pretty cool when I explain to my kids that the impact that the Batman is going to have on the world. It's a real life, from the scientific perspective, real life superhero.
Yeah.
Making a difference like that.
Incredible, Dean. It's just so fascinating. Thank you for coming on and explaining the immunity to me again. I think it's in my head now. Thank you. Thanks for coming on to the podcast, and thanks for who you are and who you've been for us in Australia. And I think your work as well will be recognised before too much longer, I am sure.
Yeah, thank you. And to the audience, thanks for listening this long.
Okay, that has been another episode of Teaching Heroes, and we'll see you all next week for another episode. Bye.